Today we're following up on the first roadmap presentation that Henry gave a few weeks ago, and this will provide more of an overview of the coalition's approach to its governance model and its business model. So we'll proceed with an overview of community power, walk through some of the earlier conceptions and implementations of community power in Massachusetts, which everything kind of evolved out of. Look at some of those key evolutions, and then show how it's been incorporated into the coalition's design. Lastly, we'll just walk through some basic risk management concepts. Next slide. So this is me. I've been doing this for over a decade, and it's very much my passion. And so I've operated, designed, and still advise a number of community power agencies, including some very innovative ones. I'm kind of dedicated to sharing best practices in terms of how to design these power agencies, and bringing in outside experts to kind of elevate the discussion locally, where communities are first encountering different ways of approaching community power. Next slide. Cliff is also on the line, probably needs no introduction. He's why we're here, the author of the Community Power Act, and oh gosh, 30 years of dedicated public service on kind of helping to restructure energy markets so that they create more benefits for the public. Next slide. Michael gets an honorable mention. He's not here, but he's the president of Duncan Weinberg, Genzer and Pembroke, and played the lead role in creating the Joint Powers Agreement that kind of maps out the governance of the Joint Action Agency. Next slide. Okay, the obligatory what is community power slide. Well, it allows cities, towns, and counties to choose where their electricity supply comes from for all the residents and businesses within their territory. Customers are automatically enrolled onto these aggregations. They're notified, and if they don't opt out, then they're enrolled if they're on the utility default service. And if they're not on utility default service, they've already signed up with a competitive supplier, and they can opt into the program. They also receive notifications, but they're not switched over automatically. And then over time, customers are allowed to choose to switch back to the utilities default service or a different competitive supplier. But once one of these programs is launched, the community itself assumes the responsibility for providing default electricity service within the city, the town, the county. Next slide. So probably everyone knew that already, but here's all the other markets where community power in one form or another is authorized, starting with Massachusetts in 1997, and New Hampshire actually had an opt-in version of this that didn't switch all the customers over earlier than Massachusetts, but Massachusetts was the one to put in the opt-out notifications and automatic enrollment that really makes these scale quite quickly and be able to create a lot of benefits at low cost. So then it was Rhode Island, Ohio, California, New Jersey, Illinois, New York, New Hampshire, and there's several other states kind of interested in enabling the policy. Next slide. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning with an overview of some of the key attributes of the Massachusetts models. There are actually two. Next slide. First is the broker model. This has become very widespread, where there's kind of a simplified org chart to show how these programs are governed and managed and operated. And essentially the municipality often releases a competitive solicitation to hire a broker. They're paid based on, they work at risk to launch the program. And they're paid usually with some sort of rider on the electricity consumed over the length of the contract. So they typically negotiate 2 to 3 year deals with a power supplier to kind of run the aggregation, provide all the requirements, and provide power at usually a fixed price for that term. And so the goal there is to kind of, hopefully your fixed price will beat the utilities default service rate that fluctuates every 6 months here. And they've also been kind of procuring more class 1 RECs in Massachusetts. There's 3 brokers in Massachusetts: Peregrine Energy, Colonial, and Good Energy, which also serves Keene now. Next slide. So this is kind of my observations on the Massachusetts market. The benefits include that a measure of rate stability over 2 to 3 years. A lot of customers appreciate that. Hopefully it's cheaper. They do produce moderate savings on average on the supply rates. Some years and some seasons can be notably high, others kind of more moderate. They're purchasing more RECs, as I noted. The areas where they kind of struggle are in terms of local programs, new customer services, and particularly new project development, because they're kind of, the management is all in the brokers, and the brokers are kind of just outsourcing the program to the supplier. And so it's a simple construct, and it creates benefits, but not all of them. It doesn't have a very broad value proposition. In terms of political coordination, there doesn't seem to be much. And so that puts communities at a disadvantage in terms of public advocacy. And that can lead to situations like Boston just tried to roll out a low-income solar program, and it was going to save millions of dollars. It was a great program, and millions of dollars for low-income customers, and all they were doing was aggregating their low-income customers and kind of facilitating them into a Massachusetts state program. And the regulators kind of sent them almost a cease and desist letter, which put the kibosh on the program. And this was after they made all the announcements and had actually begun work. So that just gives you one inkling of how, you really do have to kind of manage the regulatory risk process, and often, there's strength in numbers and coordinated engagement. Next slide. There's also another issue with that model, in that, customer expectations are evolving. So I've kind of put up kind of what customers might say. And they usually, the first 3 of these are actually the first 3 call-ins to New Hampshire Public Radio as the exchange when the coalition was debating Eversource over House Bill 315. And they pointed out, these supply charges, it's only 1/3 of my bill, so the savings are a fraction on that. And, my utility grid charges keep rising. It's actually the first 4. Could you help me lower my demand charges? That was like a small farm that had put in solar, but was still getting hammered on the demand charges, and so on and so forth. And so really, you have to approach services to your customers and community from that kind of holistic perspective, that customers don't just pay supply rates, they pay bills, their entire bill, and they like help using new technologies, changing their behaviors. sometimes, to lower costs, lower carbon, that sort of thing. Next slide. Oh, and also transportation fuels. Customers care about energy expenses broadly, right? So the other model in Massachusetts was actually the first community choice aggregator in the United States, and it still is operating. It's now a joint powers entity, similar under Massachusetts law to the Joint Powers Agency that we're creating with the coalition. So it's 21 towns on the Cape and Martha's Vineyard and Dukes County, not Nantucket Island, where I'm actually from, ironically. And they hired staff, and they have a collaborative governance structure, and they all get together and they manage it, and they have more institutional capacity. So that has given them the ability to develop a broader array of benefits to their communities. So for example, they're the only non-utility administrator of efficiency funds and programs in Massachusetts. And they're able to kind of tailor things locally. They kind of created or helped to create a solar cooperative that's installed 28 megawatts of local systems to date. Default service is just a bit above the Massachusetts RPS in terms of class 1. And then they offer an opt-up to local green product that is either 50% or 100% Massachusetts class 1 RECs. And all of that premia goes into a kind of a trust fund to build new renewables with. I think most notably for me, they are able to engage effectively at the regulatory commission. And so they hired consultants, and they devoted staff time and board time to understanding Eversource's grid modernization proposals and rate cases. And there's actually a lot of costs and risk in regulatory intervention that communities really could benefit from direct engagement with. So for example, Cape Lake Compact, I believe, avoided $40 million of costs that were going to be inappropriately billed to the Cape and Islands communities. It's kind of a cost shift between different regions of Massachusetts that they caught. Okay, next slide. And this is something we see across the industry, the broader public power industry. There's always over 70 joint power agencies have formed. They have various structures and purposes, but over the last half century, New Hampshire actually doesn't have any, but we should hopefully change that soon. I'll also point out that so this is essentially lots of cooperatives and municipal utilities getting together to share services while kind of retaining their local control authorities as cooperatives and municipalities. So they're joining together to kind of get better services at lower cost than any individual one could afford on their own. It's a basic concept. And this has given rise to a class of kind of nationwide service providers that can come in and provide fairly advanced services, almost as an extension of staff. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later because it's quite meaningful. Next slide. So this is kind of, not all technically joint powers agencies, but all of them in California are. But the general notion here is that lots of municipalities get together and operate their community power program through, a centralized entity with some staff and more advanced services and regulatory engagement. So NOPEC, I think, is 700 towns and cities. Sustainable Westchester, New York, that's 25. And then in California, there's been a lot of activity around this where I've spent a lot of time. Most of the focus of the last decade has been in California, helping to evolve these power agencies. And so there's over 14 right now operating, serving over 200 cities and counties. It's about half the market, and they've kind of rapidly taken over and scaled in the last, let's say, 5 years. They're now at the point where they're creating a statewide, what they call a super agency. It just formed earlier this year to provide the opportunity for all of them to participate in joint project development if they want to, and also shared services. Okay, next slide. So we'll take one community power agency called Redwood Coast Energy Authority. And it's very key to the evolution of the industry, actually. Next slide. They like to refer to themselves as behind the Redwood curtain because they're pretty far up north on the coast of California and hard to get to, remote, rural. And they're relatively small by California standards for community power agencies. They have 60,000 accounts. And so this was a joint powers authority that actually existed before they launched a community power program. Since 2013, they were running efficiency programs, direct install programs. And so they knew quite a bit about the power sector, and they also knew they knew nothing about commodity risk management or retail customer services or any of the other activities that a community power agency transacts. And so they took a pretty innovative approach to soliciting for the services required to operate it. They put it all out to bid on an at-risk performance-based contract basis, essentially where they didn't have to pay any upfront costs. And the initial implementation costs would be recouped over a few years, the initial contract term. And they wanted kind of the full scope of services for running their own power agency. And they got it. They got 4 bids, and they hired a great team. And that gave them the ability to kind of structure their own portfolio of power contracts in an optimal way that was kind of minimizing costs, but also seeing where they could kind of layer in the resources they wanted, local biomass in particular. So even though this was only 60,000 accounts, they launched their first year with contracts with a dozen suppliers and 20 different contracts layered in to create that portfolio designed to provide enough power and hedge risk for their customer base. That kind of full transparency of operations and that level of operational sophistication really gave them an edge in terms of understanding how the business functions in practice and how to start creating more value and innovating more for their communities. So fast forward 3 years, they're 40% renewable, California RPS compliant, a fifth comes from Humboldt, from various kind of solar projects, their biomass contracts. They've got 5.5 megawatts of flexible demand. These are things like the intelligent management of smart thermostats, HVAC, electric vehicle chargers, heat pumps, water pumps. And they can kind of turn those on and off in response to price or grid stability signals to hedge risk. They have built up a reserve fund. So they've been accruing financial reserves so that they'll be stable long term. That's allowed them to contract for new projects, new renewable and battery projects that's going to supply half their energy requirements in the next few years. They'll come online. They're going to this year begin construction on a solar and storage microgrid. This is a utility partnership actually, and that can island the county airport and the Coast Guard base. They've got a variety of local programs whirring along, and they estimate that they've kind of saved or accrued or spent locally $51 million over that time period. Plus, they brought in another $45 million for state funding to deploy more batteries on critical facilities. Next slide. Let's skip this actually. I'm lagging behind, but they're also deploying a lot of electric vehicles. Okay, so how did this happen, and kind of what's the key design insight here, and the tipping point from my on the ground experience. Next slide. That is a fuzzy graphic. Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties. The tipping point came when we realized that we could just hire the same companies that already operate suppliers and agencies to provide us as a service with these kind of, they run 24/7 operational control centers. They've got a deep bench of experts in all of the different facets of commodity risk management and portfolio management, the forecasting, the data science. And that really transfers a lot of new knowledge down to the local level and is able to kind of take advantage of or kind of merge with local insights for how to create new services, how to create the best new projects, et cetera, et cetera. And so going from left to right, the basic services for portfolio management are the forecasting and the analytics, contract origination and procurement with multiple counterparties, kind of testing their prices, valuing, are they giving you a good price or not? Contracting for it, and then so building a book of power contracts and then managing that actively over time, which also includes kind of paying attention to whether your counterparties are still creditworthy. And then they have 24/7 kind of market operations where they're scheduling your load into the, out here would be the ISO New England market, and looking at price movements, looking at your position limits, and kind of trading for margin preservation. So not taking risks, but just, if they have to sell something off or buy something so that to minimize costs to the portfolio, they're doing that. At the end of the day, they have to kind of settle with the market and all the counterparties. And so all of that's as a service. And this was really transformative, as you might imagine. And this is actually, I kept the same graphic that I used to describe this in California about 5 years ago when I was kind of explaining it to all the other agencies out there. Next slide. So this gave us kind of the ability to continuously manage our energy portfolios and implement fairly what until then was unbeknownst to most of the people in the community power industry out there, but industry standard approaches to doing this. And so that's, in terms of commodity risk management, back, middle, and front office structure, where the front office is directly transacting with parties, and all of these are kind of segregated and firewalled, and the middle office is analyzing the deals and pricing, advising the front office, and back office kind of powers all of that by collecting all the data they need to make this happen. And they're kind of continuously adjusting everything. It's all carried out in accordance with their clients, in this case, community power agencies, kind of board adopted energy risk management policies and practices and procedures. So they're remaining in compliance with how we want them to manage risk on our behalf and what sort of limits they're trading around. Next slide. So this was kind of the missing piece, because the portfolio manager contracting was the missing piece that the industry really needed, because these retail services that you're now seeing, we already knew how to contract for those separately. So a lot of community power agencies already, instead of just outsourcing everything to a supplier, they were already at least contracting for a company to kind of exchange data with the utilities. It's called the electronic data interchange, and there's various standards for each type of data that is exchanged. Managing that data, managing the billing, figuring out if we're getting the revenues that we are owed or not, tracking that, that's actually very important, as you might imagine. And then the kind of customer engagement functions. So they have all the customer account information, the usage data, and they kind of port that over to a call center so that if anyone has a question about their bills or what have you, or local programs, there's kind of scripting and all the data is there so that it goes swimmingly. Next slide. Okay, so that brings us to the Community Power Coalition's governance and business model. Next slide. So the basic insight here is the Joint Powers Agency that brings everyone together, provides the scale necessary to hire those companies and duplicate and implement quite rapidly and at no upfront cost your own power agency. And that is what allows you to structure a portfolio of contracts. Really, that provides immediate flexibility in terms of which sorts of resources you can integrate. You have local renewables you want to include in the portfolio as possible, and priced correctly. And that provides the foundational capabilities to innovate on customer services, regulatory advocacy, and really understand how to manage energy costs and risks in all these different ways. Particularly, it's the foundation for how to design local programs and customer services, new rates, technology offers that actually lower costs for the aggregation overall. So you're kind of looking at what's causing the costs, looking at what the risk factors are, and saying, okay, well, if I deploy, as Humboldt did, the smart thermostats and EV chargers and all the rest, what's that actually worth to the whole aggregation in terms of that flexibility, so on and so forth. It's also adopting the risk management policy and financial reserve policy, where you're taking part of the margin and banking it for a rainy day, assures everyone that you're kind of running it competently and you're going to be around for a long time. As certain as anything can be, I suppose. And so that's actually critical if you want to be able to develop new renewables or battery storage projects, new construction, because those require longer term commitments so that they can line the finance up, the capital investment. And these community power programs in California have transacted over 3,000 megawatts of new project development. They've actually taken over the construction of all the renewables in California. And they get to kind of pick and choose what's best for them and try and be local if they can or not. And that also flows into really knowing what you're talking about when you're advocating for different changes at the legislature or the utility commission. Next slide. So we kind of went over the big picture, and now we're going to get into the details. I like these useful, very simple concepts because, as you can see from the right, success and your ability to kind of manage those details is quite positively correlated. Next slide. Okay, so this is kind of an org chart. It's a draft I've been working on. It shows the basic structure of, put the the citizens and the voters and customers of New Hampshire at the top. The municipalities that have authorized, voted, their governing bodies have voted to authorize entering into the Joint Powers Agreement, which once executed will allow the agency to be incorporated. Although Cheshire is not yet done so, but we expect them to. They'll appoint representatives to the board of directors. All the founding members serve on that until founding members exceed 21, in which event the board is elected from all of the representatives of all of the members every year, except it's staggered. So, you know, you're not just cycling on and off each year, but for 3-year terms usually. That will eventually flow into all of these committees, populate those. Also, certain committees can have other representatives appointed, volunteers, for example. And then a limited number of staff to provide kind of expert oversight and management and strategy, really. And to ensure that the agency is kind of responsive to what the members want it to provide all of their communities. And then third-party service vendors to provide the retail customer services and the power portfolio management services. So that's kind of what it looks like. It's, you know, I like to think of it as a machine that can kind of help you achieve all of your different policy goals in new accelerated ways. One thing to note here is that kind of under the terms of the Joint Powers Agreement, you know, members can pick and choose services. They can pick and choose which contracts, project development contracts they'd like to participate in. And that's one of the kind of best practices of Joint Powers Agency design. It shouldn't kind of leave any member feeling kind of locked in beyond what they've agreed to commit to contractually. You know, if you want to get a certain service that has a certain term, same with a long-term project commitment, you'll have to commit to that. But kind of maximum flexibility beyond that. Okay, next slide. So I thought it would be useful to just kind of touch on some high-level concepts that come into play when you are starting to structure a portfolio. Next slide. So these are the kind of high-level broad categories, sources of risk that have to be understood and managed through various ways. Price risk, volumetric risk, operational risk, credit risk, policy and regulatory. Next slide. And again, the simple and useful charts. Now you're trying to buy power and then sell it for some sort of margin to cover your overhead, operating, reserve funds, everything. And so you have a margin and some headroom. And if you kind of take on too much risk, you want to hedge certain positions, you could put that at risk. And so depending upon your credit support and level of cash reserves, you can enter into the territory where you're not going to become insolvent, not have enough cash, and you're out of business. That's never happened, and we have very strenuous policies and controls around that. So touch wood. Next slide. Okay, so credit risk. This is quite straightforward. The entity that you contracted for power with, or some sort of product, energy-related product, financial hedge, isn't good for it, turns out. So how do you kind of mitigate that risk, or at least manage it? Well, you can diversify your portfolio by contracting with many different counterparties. So you're never kind of fully exposed to any one counterparty going bankrupt or otherwise reneging. You can use standard agreements. So that's kind of avoids a source of risk that lawyers introduce, like writing in special terms that they understand, and requiring a lot of transaction costs to assess. These portfolio managers have to regularly assess and monitor the creditworthiness of all the counterparties to the portfolio. Make sure some suppliers and going into the red in a different market, maybe one state over. You can say, well, you're a bit riskier. There's a kind of premium I'll have to charge for this transaction, or post some collateral. There's default swaps and insurance. Okay, next slide. Yes, price risk. So the prices for energy and all of these products change over time fairly frequently in response to changing fundamentals, supply-demand balances, movement of the forward curves, kind of where the market thinks the price of electricity and natural gas is headed. So if you've locked in certain positions and you're out of the market, that's could be something to address and mitigate. Similarly, there's kind of shape risk, where the production profile of the generation you've contracted for or the delivery of power doesn't quite match your usage profile of customers. And so, if there's a bit of a mismatch, then in certain hours, you're going to take on more or less market exposure than you thought you would. There's also basis risk, less of a concern in New England, but it's because of local transmission constraints, where you're trying to sell generation in one part of the network and kind of wheel it over to customers in a completely different region, but you hit a bottleneck in the transmission and it's at full capacity, and suddenly the prices kind of disconnect, and the supplier can be liable for that spread. So that can be dicey. The fundamentals driven by natural gas storage, transport, demand patterns, weather local and regional plays a big role in supply and demand. And then over time, the fleet composition is changing, the market price patterns are changing. You have to be able to kind of predict that as best as possible and take mitigating actions if you got it wrong. So basic strategies: match your volume, pay attention to your net open positions each month. How much are you exposed to the market? What is that kind of mismatch between your portfolio supply curve and your retail load curve? Do you want to be exposed then? Will it, can you weather the risk and actually come out ahead on that if real-time market prices are low? You have to use a variety of analytical methods to kind of quantify the financial risk you're facing from your portfolio across different dimensions. And of course, you have to continuously evolve your forecasting and the kind of data going into those analytics. Next slide. Similarly, it's volumetric risk. This is physical generation and physical demand. So it's driven by weather, and on the supply side, unplanned loss of generation, transmission curtailments. On the demand side, global pandemics do impact how we use electricity, economic activity patterns, that sort of thing. And also customer churn. If customers are leaving your aggregation or coming into your aggregation, it's going to change the amount of load in each hour that you're financially liable to serve at market prices, at least. So you want to accrue those financial reserves, give yourself a healthy margin of error. Again, diversify the resource portfolio. Don't put it all on one power plant. You can't really do that. And again, continuously evolve your forecasting capabilities in response to all of these changes. Next slide. Okay. So what could cause volatility in terms of physical supply patterns, physical demand patterns, or the price patterns thereof? Well, New England is going to be 40% renewable by 2030. So that causes a lot of physical supply volatility, which will flow through to prices. And the timing of that is going to be uncertain. How those price patterns play out, whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining or not, or how much, and what the flows of the network are and the regional weather patterns. It's all going to be very, very interesting. And this is played out in other markets. So New England is kind of behind places like California, Texas, Southwest Power Pool, and other countries, Australia, obviously. So we kind of understand that how volatility is going to increase and modeling around that. Next slide. So when this kind of gets an honorable mention, if your customers use more electricity than you expected, at the same time when prices are higher than you expected, those are multiplied together, and the result is referred to as swing risk, because it can swing quite wildly, right? Because you're responsible for serving the load at the price times the amount of load that you're exposed to on the market. So whether or not your load, whether your customers are kind of using more or less electricity at the same time when prices are more or less high, can make a big difference in the overall cost of your retail portfolio. Next slide. Yes. So as a general rule, the more complex the forecasting model and challenge, and also the longer term it is, the accuracy inherently degrades. Probably no one needs to be told that. To compensate, it's really important to have kind of a way of making very nimble decisions based on feedback kind of immediately, as soon as possible, and kind of delegating the authorities and thinking through the situations in which you would want transactions to be carried out on your behalf for those kind of unknown unknowns, because your models will get it wrong. Next slide. Okay, operational risks, similarly, I've just described as Murphy's Law is real. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong at some point. And so that's why we take such care to hire really qualified vendors. So these portfolio managers, they have multiple operations centers, usually spread across the country, sometimes at undisclosed locations because they are so vital to the power grid. They're always staffed. They're compliant with cybersecurity, physical security, triple redundancy, backup generation. They can weather pretty much anything. And then, so hire qualified vendors. They bring these kind of contingency mitigations, and then establish your what we call ERM 3Ps. That's energy risk management policies, practices, and procedures. And so what's in something like that? It's the table of contents to the risk management policy of a California community power agency. So you can see it kind of defines the sources of risk, the strategies, specifies the authorities and the limits that we want to keep to. Takes into consideration conflict of interest, which is a deep well, and kind of provides for a risk management committee, underwriting standards, et cetera, et cetera. I'm running out of time. And then after you've done all of that, maintain discipline and oversight. Next slide. So this is the section of the Joint Powers Agreement of the Coalition that mandates a risk management committee will be created. in line with these requirements and best practices, that the enterprise risk management policy will be brought forward within 1 year of the effective date, so after we incorporate, and it would be before launch, actually. And we've also put in here that an independent agent will be brought in to evaluate the operational performance of the agency in relation to that and recommend areas of improvement, because it always helps if you do have someone completely neutral to, say, your staff and especially your vendors, because this is a very critical part of running a power enterprise and needs unbiased oversight and some double checking on that. Next slide. Okay, policy and regulatory risk. There's kind of an upside and a downside to this. The downside, or the upside is it's a very regulated industry, and there's all sorts of things that we should be able to do to create value, but we're not allowed to. And so there's a political kind of cost and inaction on these reforms. And that's part of what creating a coalition is all about, that can show up and effectively advocate for those reforms. The other aspect of this is that your portfolio management intercompliance requirements actually might be impacted by changes in regulation and law. And so you have to see over that horizon and factor those, what could happen, what could change, and what could the impact be for you financially into your risk management evaluations routinely. I think I've put in here some truisms that give us a bit of a benefit here. All politics is local, and also the strength of the wolf is the pack. Because when all of the communities get together, things generally, we just get a seat at the table. Next slide. Okay, recap and next steps. So quickly, next slide. It's a dense slide, but I've kind of put one. Okay, so our portfolio manager adopted an ERM policy, form the risk committee, discipline and oversight, structure that diverse portfolio on all these different metrics to spread and hedge risk optimally, manage it actively over time, against short-term market fluctuations, hedging and trading for margin preservation to maintain your, roughly in line with what you budgeted. And also kind of consider so keep positions open, or the ability to open up those positions over time to allow you to contract for new projects, because technological innovation, putting the right facilities in the right places across the state can yield gains and hedge you from risk in new ways that didn't even exist before those new facilities were built. So that's what the portfolio flexibility is for. And then engage at the legislature. Next slide. Conclude with this. Very simple insights. Create, everyone getting together gives us the scale to actually do this. Actually hiring all of these functions and integrating them into a new kind of custom designed competitive power agency for New Hampshire will give all the communities that participate a lot of flexibility and new knowledge, new capabilities, new insights over time, the foundation to really evolve how services are offered to customers, how local programs are designed in ways that create maximum benefit, not just from a supply perspective, but again, going back to that customer full bill perspective. Often there's a lot of correlation. We put in enough demand, flexible demand, we can also avoid transmission peak upgrades. We can lower bills there, and we can lower the need to avoid, or we can lower the need to invest in network upgrades over time. There's actually a tremendous amount of savings there to be gained forever. Okay, next slide. And this was from the first roadmap webinar. It's the last slide. If you're interested in joining the coalition and kind of going forward with the local approval process to really kind of define how you're going to approve a community power plan, get in touch and consider recommending to your governing body that they vote to approve entering into the joint powers agreement and joining the coalition. And we have a lot of kind of resources to provide prospective members throughout this journey. And that's it. Last slide. We have 4 minutes for questions. I apologize, but we also had trouble at the outset. And we have a follow-up Q&A as well. So thank you very much.
All right, if anyone has questions, you can either put them in the question box or raise your hand and I can unmute you.
You might tell folks how to raise their hand.
Oh, you can raise your hand in your, I forget where it would be. In your dashboard, there's a way to raise your hand there, a button to click.
Or we can assume I've explained commodity risk management flawlessly to everybody in the audience.
Yeah.
Or everybody's gone to sleep.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah, there should be a little button in your control panel to the left that looks like a hand with an arrow under it. There's one from Craig.
Yes, hi, this is Craig Lazinski in Derry. I'm with the Local Energy Committee. On previous webinars, the organizational slides shown were rather simple, if you will excuse that term, generally easy to follow and very clear. The organizational chart that Samuel showed is significantly more complex in its organization, and I'm just curious as to how we're progressing with community power in New Hampshire. Is there a large organization that needs to be put together as this concept moves along?
Cliff?
Hello. Yeah, that's what we're putting together. The Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire is designed to be that entity. And so you know, we've got this small core of communities where the governing bodies have already voted to join. There's a fair number of additional communities that are in the process of doing that, as well as a lot more who are just monitoring things and thinking about how to move forward with community power aggregation. You know, we have spent a lot of time on legislative issues, sort of year to date, and we're also turning to the issue of administrative rules that the PUC needs to propose, but they're sort of partially waiting for pending legislation to move forward. Senate House Bill 315 in particular, which the Senate amended and the House is expected to concur with that, although it could go to committee of conference if there's other controversies. So yeah, that's we have, you know, Samuel and Henry have been retained by the city of Lebanon through a grant that we got funded, with the idea that we would need assistance to fully develop our business plan and our strategy to sort of get the most that we can out of community power aggregation. And so we've been working towards that end. And a number of us are in the progress of reviewing and firming up electric aggregation plans. And one of the things the coalition can offer and help folks with is looking at those, providing a template for an aggregation plan that could also be customized by the local community. I mean, it has to be customized because there's a lot of choices to be made based on your own local community. Although, I'm sure a lot of communities will sort of watch to see what happens, but we've got some good momentum with two cities, Nashua and Lebanon, and potentially other cities and municipalities joining over the course of the summer. So, realistically, we don't expect probably to launch until probably into the first quarter or late or early, hopefully second quarter of next year. So that over the course of the fall, we hope to be soliciting the potential vendors and starting to engage them. And the scale of initial staffing will depend a lot on how we scale up, how we're expected to scale up based on communities that are sort of the first movers in the group. Does that help?
As we are short on time right now, we can go through one more question, and then if you have any more questions, feel free to email me at joshua@cleanenergynewhampshire.org, or Samuel, what was your email that you'd like people to email you at?
Golding@communitychoicepartners.com.
Okay, I can send that out to the list after this webinar. There's a question in the bar that is from Richard Wagenroth, which is there a certain number of communities that are needed for this to take off?
Well, we're going to
get myself unmuted, sorry. Our goal has been a minimum of 5 to sort of go ahead and launch and incorporate, but preferably maybe closer to a dozen by around August 1st is when we hope to be able to execute the joint powers agreement and incorporate and start that process to work on over the course of the fall.
Great, thank you.
There's an ongoing organizing group that has been meeting almost weekly for over a year and a half now, or almost a year and a half now, that has, some of these communities and others have been represented in that group.
Okay, thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Community Power Coalition for helping organize this series. Thank you for everyone for coming. With any questions, please email me or Samuel. Our emails will be sent out and we're in the invitation. Have a great day.
I'm at clifton.below@lebanonnh.gov and on the city website.
All right. Have a good day, everybody, and thank you for coming.
Bye.